Hi, welcome to Seed Starting for the Small Farm and Garden. My name is Dave Colson, and I, with my wife, operate New Leaf Farm in Durham, Maine. And I'm going to talk some today about seeding, starting seeds, greenhouse use, and potting mixes. So our farm, located in Durham, has been certified organic since 1985, first established in '82, and we sold commercially through 2014. Since then, we've mostly been doing our own gardens, kind of a large homestead. We have acquired a lot of tools and materials for doing seeding. Of course, we used to do it at a much larger scale than we do now. But I'll share with you some of the tips that we have in starting seeds here at the farm. So this is the time of year when all the seed catalogs start to show up, which is always fun because there's never any weeds in the winter garden as you're considering what to grow, what to start for the summer garden. So why start seeds? The primary reason that we have is that we can access many more varieties through the seed catalogs and starting our own seed than we can buying through garden centers or even farmers markets. Now, those are wonderful sources of plants, and I wouldn't want to turn anyone away from those sources. But if you're interested in trying different varieties, or you've seen things during the growing season that were a problem for you, or you like the look of a different variety, then starting those seeds yourself can be a great way to go. And also, it's a great way to save money. Seeds are generally a lot cheaper to purchase than seedlings themselves. So with that, we're going to get into some containers and media and see different pieces that go into the seeding process. Lots of containers to talk about. A lot of this is for perhaps a larger scale that a lot of folks are working on for the home garden. Small farm, this would be what most folks are using these days. So a lot of what's being used these days are these plastic type flats, unfortunately disposable. They typically need to be inserted into a tray, which is not really what you're growing in, but it gives more strength so these flimsier plastic pieces will hold up. So this would be the basic tray. It is inside one of those, as the rest of these are. And this is just a big wide open tray. Fill it with soil mix and seed what you like into there. Now there are a couple other ways of doing that starting. These are a couple different types of trays. These would again be filled with soil mix. And this particular one I like a lot for the actual seed starting to begin with, because you can put a small amount of different seeds in each of these different rows, and they're kept separate rather than the big tray. And from here, once they've germinated, they can be moved out into larger flats. Some seeds that may be too big for this kind of smaller tray, a similar kind of thing here, can seed directly into this and move into other trays. Now this would be for something like squash or pumpkins or cucumbers or things like that. Sometimes starting, especially on a smaller scale, you want to create that humidity inside of the tray for the initial germination. And for that they do make these domes that clip down over the top of the tray, and once you water, they will kind of hold the water into the tray so that you don't have to run out to water them quite as often. Once we get going, there are a variety of sizes here. So here's a couple of different types of sizes in the plastic trays. This would be really useful for something like lettuce, broccoli, things that are maybe only in the tray for 4 to 6 weeks and don't get that big when they're transplanted out. These would be for something a little larger, like tomatoes or peppers, things that are maybe you want to get a little bigger before you put them out into the garden. Again, just a little bigger. And these will break apart so that you can have these 6-packs of plants rather than the whole tray. And again, just another size. Often I hear that folks like the square cell better than the round, partly because the seeds in a round tray, the roots will tend to wrap around inside the cell versus the square tray where they will tend to go down. And all of these have a hole in the bottom so that you don't have to worry about over soaking the seeds. You soak the tray down really well, excess water will drip out the bottom, and hopefully you'll get good germination. Another possibility here would be these larger pots. These are a 3.5-inch pot, and they fit about 18 into each one of these trays, which is kind of convenient. These I would use in place of the smaller square pots. We do a lot of our tomatoes and squash and cucumbers in these. And oftentimes we'll move from these original seeding trays into the square pots for those plants. For those that maybe would not want to get into all the plastic and would like something that would last a little longer, these ones certainly last well. We clean them out and reuse them year after year. There's another type of flat that are called a speedling tray. And these are made out of styrofoam, I know, another not so great material, but these hold up really well and we've used for multiple years, sometimes 8 or 10 years before they start to wear out. And these are available through the Speedling Corporation, and you can look that up online to see sources. They aren't typically sold in garden centers. So smaller cells and larger cells again. And then there's another system that's kind of cool. This is AP Systems. This is a 24 count. And the way this works, of course you have your holes in the bottom for drainage. The bottom of it becomes the tray that everything sits on, filled with soil. So it will still drain, but keeps the soil from running out the bottom. And then when you're ready to transplant, you flip it over and you pop the plants out with these little knobs on the bottom. So that's kind of a cool system to use, and a smaller amount of plants than some of the big trays. So in starting your seedlings, you want to have a medium that you can put into your flats or your seedling trays to start your seeds in. Now the old style of making a medium was to use a simple mix of garden soil, compost, and sand for drainage. Now those still work well and are certainly relatively cheap and easy to do. The problem is that you can bring in diseases in with the soil or the compost that ends up affecting your plants. It's called damping off and can be caused by organisms such as Phytophthora or Pythium. And what happens is those organisms get started on the surface of the soil and girdle the little seedling, or in some cases the seed won't even germinate and you dig it up out of the soil, out of the mix, and the disease has affected the inside of the seed itself. So in order to stop that in a typical old style mix, you would heat the soil to a temperature of 180 degrees, and you'd want to leave it there for about 30 minutes. They do make large-scale soil sterilizers that can be used to do that heating. It can also be done in the home kitchen in the oven, again heating to 180 degrees for 30 minutes, but you might not want to do that in the kitchen because the smell can be pretty incredible. So because of all of that and the hassle of doing that kind of heating, pretty much everyone has moved to what we call a soilless mix. And that means there actually isn't garden soil in the mix, but a series of different pieces that make the right kind of mix for starting seeds that don't have the possibility of those pathogens in them. So some of the ingredients that you'll see, typically the ones that I like are a compost base. This is some of our compost, and it's very well decomposed. That could be used, but we purchase our seedling mix these days and don't use our own compost. The compost needs something in it that will help with drainage, and there's a couple of different things that can be used here. Now this is vermiculite, and it's actually expanded mica. It's heated, the mica is heated inside at a high temperature and pops like popcorn, so it expands. It's very light and loose and helps with drainage. The more common one that you'll see, and a lot of folks mistake this for a fertilizer, this is actually perlite, which is volcanic rock pumice that's been ground up. And it doesn't have any nutrients to it. It just acts like the sand in the original mix and helps with drainage. It's very light. So if you ever made any of the old mixes with the garden soil compost and sand, they were very heavy and a lot to carry around, whereas these components are very light. And then typically we have peat moss. And the peat moss generally comes in bales, sometimes called sphagnum moss. This I purchased separately. We use for other uses, and it's added to the mix to help with drainage. It also has quite a water holding capacity once it's broken up. I think it's like 30 to 60 times its water holding capacity. Very hard to moisten to begin with, but once it's wet, it holds water quite well. Those are the basic mixes, and we'll go on and talk a little bit about how to care for those mixes and how to prepare them for starting your seedlings. Okay, so we've decided to purchase a commercial soil mix to start our seeds in. There's a number of them available. You can check different garden centers. I typically like a mix that is a compost-based mix rather than something like the chemical-based mixes, meaning that those other mixes are pretty much sterile and a chemical fertilizer is added, and they're generally watered with a light chemical fertilizer in order to provide nutrients. Whereas with the compost-based mix, the nutrients are in the compost itself. Now this mix has a variety of the things we were talking about, has the white perlite pieces, has compost obviously, and the peat moss in it as well. Now one of the things that you want to be careful of when you're starting a mix is making sure you get it well wetted before you start your seeds in it. And I'll demonstrate that with this little tray. So this is just some mix that is dried out pretty excessively. It's been sitting for quite a while. I'm just going to take the water here and I'm going to wet that down pretty well. Float a little water on top, and we're going to leave that for a while. We'll come back to that and we'll take a look at that later. This mix I've already pre-watered. In some cases, I'll actually dump the soil mix through a screen. This is a 1/4-inch screen. Often the soil mixes are pre-screened to a 1/2 inch. If I'm using a small cell or small seeds, often I'll sift the soil mix to the 1/4 inch just so it's a little finer and not so much coarse material in it. If I'm potting off a larger pot, like a 3.5 inch pot or a much bigger pot, I'll leave that since those larger particles will help it drain a little better. So you want to pre-wet your mix. Often I'll do that sometimes the day before, generally a good hour or so before you want to use it to give it all a chance to break up. And what we're looking for is a mix that will kind of come together a bit but easily breaks apart. So this is moist enough now so that it will easily absorb water once we've put the seeds into the trays. Now, I like to use a wheelbarrow for filling trays. It just gives you a surface to work on. And we make a simple piece that goes on top so that we have a work area. Then we take our tray or our pots, and I just use a little cup or something, and I'll spread that out onto the tray, making sure I get it into all the cells. Even a little excess is not a bad thing. And then we take off the excess. So you don't need to pack it down super hard. Generally, when you're going to seed, you're going to be making an imprint there anyway. Now for the little larger pots, I'll just kind of fill and shake those as I go, get them to about the size that I'm looking for. So now we're ready to start our seeds. I like to keep my seeds in a container. Don't worry about what it is. This is an old metal box that we had. What's nice about it is that it's got plenty of space for keeping the seed packets, and being a metal tin, I don't have to worry about rodents getting in here if I leave it out in the greenhouse. But a good container, and seeds will last for a number of years, so you want to keep them relatively cool and dry to store them. Now, for seed starting, we want to have there's a number of things that we need to consider. So some of those things are the germination time, the temperature, the moisture levels, and then the amount of light that plants or light for the plants to germinate with. So temperature first, generally a temperature of about 70 to 75 degrees is ideal, which is why having a greenhouse to start things in is so ideal, because generally we have a warm temperature in here, we have supplemental heat. We also have a set of heat mats. Ours are rather extensive because we're starting a lot of seedlings. They are, you can buy them in smaller segments, or there are smaller mats that you can purchase. I also know a number of folks that have repurposed old refrigerators or freezers and utilize a light bulb inside, incandescent light bulb in this case, because you're trying to generate some heat, and they start their seeds there. I've also heard of folks using a compressor motor, like a motor on a refrigerator or something like that, or if you have a warm spot, sunny warm spot in the house, a windowsill, something of that nature, if you don't have a specific space to start your seedlings. You want to try and keep that temperature in that medium, as I said, to about 70, 75 degrees. And often it takes at least 5 to 7 days for seeds to germinate. In some cases, some take longer than that. During that period of time, most seeds don't need light to germinate. A few seeds, particularly a lot of the flower seeds, the seeds are so small that they generally are not covered with soil. They're just seeded on the surface of the flat. And those often do need light to germinate. So having a light source, either a bulb or a grow light or something like that, will if you don't have natural light, an artificial light will work. And generally what you want to do is try to keep the medium moist. Now, we talked a bit about damping off, which can happen when the soil is too moist at certain times. So my recommendation is when you seed into whatever tray you're going to do, and then once the seeds are in, you wet that down really well. You want to try and keep it moist, but particularly after the seeds begin to germinate, you want to try and let that flat dry out overnight. Not completely dry out, but the surface of the flat. If that dries down somewhat and does not have standing water in it, then the damping off diseases have less chance of getting started. So we water really well first thing in the morning. If it's a cloudy day, that may be the only time we water. If it's a bright sunny day like today, we'll come in again at the middle of the day and water again, but leaving it so that by the end of the day, the surface of the flat is somewhat dried out. Okay, so now we're ready to start some seeds. So there's a couple of different potential seed starting pieces. This is one. We talked about this tray earlier. What's really nice about this one, as you can see, I've only got a few rows filled with soil mix, and can pretty easily just start a couple of different varieties in here. I push the soil down into the row a little bit to give a place to put the seeds in, and then I'll gently sprinkle some of the seeds across the top. The other way is in a larger tray like this, and in this case I would just take my fingers and I would make an indentation in here so that I have somewhere to drop the seed into. So these would be really great for something like lettuce, basil, broccoli, things that will germinate pretty quickly, and you're going to take them out of this tray pretty quickly because obviously there's not much room for them there. This tray would be more for something like a tomato or a pepper, a cucumber, a squash, where the plant's going to get a little bit bigger a little quicker. So we would seed one or maybe even two seeds into each cell and then thin them down to a single plant once they've germinated. Once we have the seed in, then we would take some loose soil mix and just kind of lightly spread that over the top, unless this was a seed that needed light to germinate, and in that case we wouldn't cover it with soil mix. These are a little bit deeper. A good rule of thumb is roughly 3 times the size of the seed is about the depth that you would go for seeding. So once those seeds are in here, same thing. If I have something that needs more light, which I probably wouldn't use this tray for, but if it was a squash seed or tomato seed, then again I would just lightly sprinkle some soil mix over the top, pat that down, and perhaps just take the excess off. Water that really well, and in the case of this one, we may decide to use our dome to get keep a little extra moisture into the flat as it's germinating. we've started some seeds, and now we want to be able to remember what it is we've done, since it's hard to tell what's happening here in this tray. Even if it's all the same seed within one tray, we want to be able to label them so we know what it is we were doing. And one trick we learned, rather than spending money on the typical spikes, little tags that go in the trays, is we buy a box of 1,000 popsicle sticks, very cheap, often available in a craft store, and we use that to write what we have on here. So I like to generally put the date that I've seeded something, what the seed was, such as tomato or squash, and then the variety that I seeded. And I'll use both sides of the tag for that. And I like to use a Sharpie, since it's waterproof and you won't lose it, lose the labeling while you've been watering. So this is then what it would look like. Here's the date and what it was and the variety. And in this case, this tray has a couple different things in it, and so we can look back and know what it is we started. Now we're at a stage where we've had germination of our flat, and in this case, you can see some of these seeds have germinated really well, some have not so much. The main reason in this particular one is this year's seed, and this is last year's seed. So in some cases, buying new seed is a good idea. You're more assured of better germination. In some cases, you can get pretty good germination out of past year's seed. It's often worthwhile, if you're questioning it, you can take a few seeds, moisten a paper towel, put them into the paper towel, and see what kind of germination you get. So if you're getting enough of them to germinate, then might as well use it. In this case, we were trying to compare 2 different years, and obviously the newer seed was doing a little better. But in this case, these seeds, this is spinach, and these plants need a little bit more room and a little bit more time in the greenhouse before they go out into the growing area. So I have a couple of different trays here, a couple different potting pieces, and this process you could refer to as transplanting. We're transplanting from one type tray into another. It's also called pricking out, because you're pricking the plant out of the tray, one tray, and putting it into another. Now, the way I like to do that is I use a highly technical tool, basically a kitchen knife, and what I do with that is just make a little hole in the flat, and then enlarge it a little bit. My finger acts pretty well as a good dibble. Open that up a bit, and then again I use the knife. These are cell trays here, so they're walled sides. I slide the knife down the side. I pop that little cell out. And what's so great about these, rather than being in one big open tray, is that I preserve all of this root system as I pull it out. It's not tangled in with others. I don't need a knife to cut them up. So much less disturbance to the seedling that they usually take much quicker than in a bigger open tray. So then I just pop that plug into the other tray, press it down a bit, and I'm done. So it's a pretty quick process, popping these out and laying them into the tray. The other way to do it, if you need a little bit more room, and again, squash seed, cucumbers really don't like to be moved too often, so they're going to be moved from their first flat into the ground. So I would start those right directly in these large 3.5-inch pots, or even bigger. Things like tomatoes, I will often go, or a pepper, I will often go from this size to this size to this size, so that I can give the plant plenty of space. but also be able to let it get bigger before it goes into the ground. Now this process for this is very similar. Just make a little hole, pop the seedling out into the tray, press it in, and you're done. And then just watering it in well and keeping an eye on it for a couple of days to make sure that you aren't seeing excessive wilting. So now that we've started our seeds and we've recorded them on our little tags here so that we know what's in the flat, once we've gotten done with putting the seeds out and they've grown well, or maybe they didn't grow well, or we're thinking about next winter and we want to consider a different variety, we want to do some record keeping in order to keep track of what it was we did. And what I like to do is key everything in my garden and my record keeping, maps of the garden, lists of things. I key it on the particular plant that I'm doing and particularly the date it was seeded. So I transfer that from these little tags to a notebook. And the notebook has things in it like obviously the date it was started, the seed and the variety, which are on the tag. I put in here the seed company that the seed came from. I like to record whether it's an organic seed or not, and for certified organic growers, that's quite important. I seed the amount, or record the amount that I seeded. If it's transplanted and not direct seeded in the ground, I will write down the transplanting date when that happens, the amount of seedlings that I actually put out, and in some cases that's not the same as the number of cells that you might start. So for instance, you might start 10 cells of a certain plant, but only 7 germinated, so then I would record in there that difference. I write into the record where in the garden it was planted, and then any other additional comments that I might have. The nice thing about this is that you can, if you keep a garden map of where you have things in the garden, if you're curious about that particular plant, again, the seeding date is used to key off of. So I can look at my garden map, find the date that that was planted, and look back and find all this information on that particular plant. And then next winter, as I'm beginning to consider some of these things, rather than just have kind of a list of all the things that I was hoping to plant from last year, or a list of the seeds that I ordered, I actually have a list of what I actually planted initially in the greenhouse, and how many I put into the field, so that we can decide whether that variety worked well, where it came from, whether we want to try something else, whether we want to seed more, and so on. So having that record, it's an easy step to forget about or to not bother to do, but having that record in the winter to be able to consider, I find is very useful. And additionally, I just wanted to mention, sometimes for new folks that are starting seeds, the difficulty is knowing what it is you're looking at. Sometimes, if your soil, especially if you're making your own soil mix, there may be some other weed seeds that are in there that may come up. That even sometimes happens in a purchased soil mix. So sometimes it's good to know what it is you're looking at. And this particular book was done by Parks Seed Company a number of years ago. I did look it up. It is available on eBay these days. But what's really great about this is that it's really just about starting seeds. So it'll have a mature picture, has a lot of stuff on flowers in here, but it will have, like here is onions. It'll have a picture of the mature onion, but also a great picture of the seedling as it's just germinating, so that you can look at that and know what it is, or be assured of what it is that's coming up. It also gives you some really good information on germination, temperature for germination, whether it needs light, how deep to sow it, and so on. and then the kind of culture or what the plant prefers to grow in once you've transplanted it outdoors. So now we've seen about starting seedlings and potting them off and getting them ready to go outside, but maybe we should consider what it is we want to plant. So there are some plants that really don't do well or generally are not started inside. A lot of those are things like peas and beans that germinate pretty quickly. They do pretty well outside and don't really need to be started inside. Other ones, some of the quick annual herbs such as cilantro, dill, don't really need to be started inside as well. And a lot of the things that we do start inside can also be done outside. We were potting off some spinach, which some folks may be surprised that we start our spinach indoors. It can be done indoors, but it does pretty well outdoors as well. Lettuce can be done outdoors, particularly if you're not trying to get a head of lettuce. You can seed a row in the garden of lettuce and just cut the small seedlings. Other things benefit from some time in the greenhouse. And often I think about a lot of those things as being the more tender plants. By tender plant, I mean a plant that cannot take cold temperatures. Generally, once you hit 32 degrees or below, things like tomatoes, squash, cucumbers, basil, they'll be pretty heavily damaged by those cold temperatures. So you want to wait until the season has settled out, so to speak, so that we're done with our frost before those things are ready to go in the garden. Now here in Maine, it's often a race from that moment that the garden is warm enough, the soil's warm enough, and the frost has gone, between that and getting your first frost in the fall. And so on a tomato, or particularly a pepper, you probably would not have enough time if you direct seeded those in the garden to have them ready to use or to eat fresh or to do some storage, canning or freezing with, which is why folks generally buy those things, but also why we start them and grow them out for a few weeks in the greenhouse. Now, in looking at when to start those things, what's really useful is to look up for your location the estimated last frost date in the spring. We typically thought of that in the past as right around the middle of May here in Durham, but I had noticed, because I generally keep good records, that about 50% of the time we were worried about frost during that very middle of the month. So we began to put that off for another week or so because of our own observations of frost time, and generally found that that extra week in the greenhouse was beneficial for those plants. But you want to think about the timing of when you want to start those things. Not all of these plants take the same amount of time to get to a size to put them out in the garden. So I like to break it up and keep it simple. Oftentimes when you read in literature, read about on seed packets or things, there'll be different dates like 11 weeks or 9 weeks or 8 weeks, 4 weeks, and it gets really confusing. You end up with this crazy calendar of all these different seeding dates. So I try to keep it simple. I have those seeds that I know that I'm going to direct seed in the ground, and then I have the seeds that I know take 4 weeks, 6 weeks, and 8 weeks to be ready to go out. So I organize all my seeds for planting so that they fall into one of those 3 planting dates. And then I can ramp up and get things ready to go in those time frames. So for instance, peppers generally take longer than tomatoes, so they would need more like the 8-week period of time. But I like my tomatoes to get big enough before I put them out in the garden so they have a bit more of a head start. So I might start my tomatoes, which really only take about 4 to 6 weeks before they're ready to go out if you're using a small tray or a small cell or pot. But what I like to do is start them around the same time as the peppers, and then I put them into a second size tray or cell for a little bit, and then I might even put them into a bigger pot like the ones we put the spinach into. Now the advantage of that is that the tomatoes get a little bigger. The disadvantage of leaving them in your original pot is that you don't want, particularly on most plants and tomatoes for sure, you don't want to slow down their growth. So if that plant root has begun to take up the full size of the cell that it's in, it's going to think, oh, I don't have any more room to grow, and its metabolism is going to slow down to utilize the nutrients and the size of the cell that it's in. So the key with something like a tomato or pepper is to have it in the first cell for 2-3 weeks, put it into a little bit bigger one, have it in there for a couple of weeks, and then into the larger one, or go right into the larger pot if you don't want to transplant as many times. But the key is to not let it stop that succession of growth so it continues along and is really ready to go when you put it out into the field. And again, tender plants and hardier plants, very hardy plants like everything in the cabbage family, chard for instance, even lettuce to a great degree, can take a fair amount of cold. And they can go out earlier in the year, but that rule of thumb kind of remains the same. It's roughly this 6 to 8 week period of time that they're going to need if you're starting them indoors before they go out. So knowing your transplanting date ahead of time helps you to count back to when you're doing your original seeding. So they've been growing in the house or in a greenhouse or somewhere warm where they're pretty protected. They're out of the wind. They're not necessarily in direct sunlight. And we're going to put them right out into potentially kind of a cold and different environment that they've been in. And that's why we like to use something like a cold frame. This can be something simple like some simple hoops in a plastic cover so that the seedlings can go under a cover of some kind, or they can be a more complex type of a hoop house, or old window sashes built into a cold frame will work pretty well. But something where the plants are somewhat protected at night, and definitely protected from rainfall or excessive rainfall when they're out getting ready to go into the garden, because they can pretty easily be overwhelmed by rain on these flats. And we don't really want to wash whatever nutrients are in there or potentially cause damping off problems by excessive moisture. So you definitely want to think about that second stage, going from the seedling area, hardening them off in some kind of a cold frame. And then transplanting into the garden, one of the things that I really like about starting seeds and having them in trays is that I can really fill the whole area that I'm growing in. So if I have a limited garden space, rather than starting seeds directly in the ground and not knowing how the germination is going to go, or whether the plant spacing will be what I want, this way I can measure them out, plant them out into the garden, get them in the spacing that I want, and they've got a nice jump start of that 4 to 8 weeks that they've had in the greenhouse. So they're ready to go, and hopefully we'll grow lots of good crop for you over the growing season. And finally, what I'd like to say is don't worry about keeping seeds over into other seasons. Some don't do well when they're kept over, particularly anything in the onion family, better to start new with. Lettuce seeds will often last 5 years, tomatoes 2, 3, 4 years. There is good lists that you can find on the internet that do talk about the longevity of different seeds, but you don't necessarily have to buy the new seeds every year, but you do want to take care of where you're keeping them. They want to stay relatively cool and dry, so finding a good space for those seeds to be, and not just leaving them out in the sun, for instance, or in your greenhouse where it can be excessively hot or moist. And then I'd also like to put in a plug for MAFCA's fact sheets. And if you go on to mafca.org and look under publications and fact sheets, there's a number of great fact sheets in there. I think the one that's most appropriate for what we've been talking about today is MAFCA's fact sheet on soilless mixes for vegetable seedling production. And it'll talk about a lot of the different pieces that I talked about today, their uses, why you might want to use those, and so on. So take a look. It's a great resource, and thank you for listening.